Kenyon, might you have just a few moments? I was driving to Chicago last night.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, I got in rather late. I did not get very much sleep. It would be really helpful as I'm looking to transition to nap time. Do you think you could offer a story?
You know what? I have one of those for you today. Let's do it. Before we get started, when everyone's grabbing their binkies and their babas, let's get, maybe the appropriate music dialed in. Whoa, what? No. Eddie, let's do more appropriate for relaxation.
There.
Thank you. I'll do. Okay, so today I wanted to talk about Tommy Quickly and the NEMS stable. What? Horses? No. So NEMS is the Brian Epstein management company, and we've been learning that he didn't just manage the Beatles. No. He managed quite a few artists.
A stable.
Even a stable of horses, and then also musical artists. Drake's drum. So I want to talk about Tommy Quickly a little bit, and then I wanted to cover all the other artists I could find that at some point were signed to NEMS. And that is not a definitive list. I would like to ask the audience that if you have any more information on anyone else that was signed to NEMS, I keep finding new random names that keep popping up. So we'll try to do our best. So Tommy Quickly, we had talked a little bit in the podcast about him and this song, but he had previously been given the song Tip of My Tongue, as we said, and seemingly had all the right exposure, but could never break into the hearts of the UK fans, or really anyone's hearts. But, UK was his city, as they say. He was given a last chance with this song in terms of how it's going to go with NEMS and Beatles and, Northern Song, Stick James, etc. And, in my opinion, this is probably the best quality song that he had been offered. It's possible that due to poor material, he never hit it big. Because by all accounts, Tommy Quickly was an amazing performer. It was magnetic and people loved to watch him. Brian was drawn to him, and other people I've read about mentioned how amazing he was, but maybe he just never had the right song. He never had that hit. John and Paul were in attendance at the recording session. Again, this is alleged. I don't have any sources here on this, but Tommy gave up while recording, and they had done 17 takes of the song, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't finish it. And so I guess John and Paul were like, I guess we could use this for ourselves. I don't know if there was even a thought to offer it to someone else, but in any case, you snooze, you lose. After being dropped by his label Pi and NEMS at the beginning of 1965, it seemed over for Tommy. The band that did back him, the Remo 4, did go on to back Billy J. Kramer after the Dakotas were out of the picture, and they were billed as the New Dakotas instead of the Remo 4, interestingly. And in 1966, Tommy, so he did spend some time in Walton Hospital in Liverpool after a mental breakdown. As I mentioned, it's, I think, the whole thing of being famous or, going on the road with the Beatles, that whole thing multiple times. I mean, it can take a toll. So who were the other NEMS artists? Who else did Brian sign? Well, it's crazy because I thought that maybe he had the Beatles. He signed like a handful of others. We've talked about many of them. I'm going to go over in a second here. And then, he had like 5 artists that he tried to manage. And obviously the Beatles were the biggest, and that kind of unraveled. And then he kind of focused on the Beatles. But it was much, much worse than that. So we have obviously the Beatles. We have Jerry and the Pacemakers, who, they formed before the Beatles, actually, in 1956. They originally called Jerry and the Mars Bars, but the Candy Company did try to sue them, so they changed that. If you don't know them, go check them out. They're a huge, huge band. Then we have Billy J. Kramer with the Dakotas. They got their chart success from Beatles songs. They were managed by NEMS, of course. We've talked about them a lot. We have The Foremost, which we talk about in Hello Little Girl and I'm in Love. Those were 2 songs they released. And if you want that story, go to those. Then we have a band called The Big Three. So who are the Big Three?
Who are the Big Three?
Thank you. They were a band that used to be called Cass and the Casanovas. And Cass and the Casanovas was one of those bands that were really big in their time and were notable, but maybe only if you're like deep in the lore of the early UK bands or whatever. They auditioned for Larry Parnes with the Beatles. So the guy that gave everyone funny names, Billy Hurricane or whatever, Billy Fury. The Beatles at that audition were the Silver Beatles. Long John and the Silver Beatles was kind of what came out of that. They were at that audition. So that's kind of, a big connection moment here. And after Brian Cassar, which is the lead guy, he left, they formed a trio out of the remnants of that band who got signed to NEMS as the Big Three. They were sent over to Hamburg, and their main hit, the one that they did, was Some Other Guy, which is that song we see the Beatles playing in the cavern. Some of that earliest footage that we see of the Beatles, where they're all bouncing up and down, whatever. They released Some Other Guy on Decca, and the partnership between them ended in July 1963, so about a year ago from our current timeline of the Beatles, but they were signed. We also have Tommy Quickly. We also have Cilla Black. Okay, we've talked about those. Cilla Black, we've talked about In Love to the Loved, and it's for you if you want to listen to those stories. Then we have Sounds Incorporated. Now, they were a band from South London, and they were kind of the kings of the backing bands. They started as Gene Vincent's backing band after he lost his own band. So that's, kind of an important name there. And then they backed the huge... So we kind of talked about this with the Rhodesians, or the Strangers, or the Diamonds, they were called, I guess, in Rhodesia. But they kind of became a band that was the backing band for all the big artists that came through. Well, that's what Sounds Incorporated was for the UK. They backed Little Richard, they backed Jerry Lee Lewis, Brenda Lee, Sam Cooke, these people. So they kind of were like the backing band that could do anything with anyone. Knew all the songs, etc. They released a record on Parlophone and then moved to Decca before they met the Beatles in Hamburg in 1962. So they were already doing this. And through this connection, they got signed up with NEMS. And I talked about them a little bit on the Around the Beatles discussion that we had. I don't remember what song that was, but they played in that TV special. And they also went on the Australian tour and all that stuff. So anyway, Sounds Incorporated. They were there.
Got it.
We also have The Circle. We talked about them with Nancy on the I'm Happy Just to Dance With You podcast, but they're the only American band that Brian signed. One of Brian's business associates, Nathan Weiss, heard the band in Atlantic City, of all places, and recommended them to Brian. They were known as the Rondells, and they were from Pennsylvania. Brian liked them. He renamed them with a little help from John, who made it spelled weird, like he always did.
Always does.
Yes. And then, Brian managed them briefly. They toured with the Beatles during the 1966 American tour, which we will be talking about in a few years, some point. And then they broke up, and 2 members became famous jingle writers. I didn't write down everything they wrote, but there's probably a commercial that you've known of theirs. Moving on, Michael Haslam. When Brian was going to see Billy J. Kramer, he saw Michael performing and discussed signing with him. It seems like this is the way that Brian does business. He kind of has this thing. He sees someone perform and he goes up. He's like, hey, you got what it takes, kid. And so Michael jumps on board. He toured with the Beatles during the British tour in 64, which we'll be talking about soon in a few episodes, and was on the bill for the Christmas show. So again, he was like the new protege. I kind of feel like he was the Tommy Quickly replacement, actually. He was kind of the hot new singer that might have been what Tommy Quickly was supposed to be and never ended up being, like the male version of Cilla Black.
Got you.
They tried to get some hit records from him, either from Bacharach or Lennon McCartney, but that never happened for him, and Haslam never had a hit. There was also a confrontation about some silly purchases that Haslam had made. He was told that Epstein would cover expenses while either on tour or something, and I guess he bought socks. Brian didn't think socks should be in the budget, so he was let go.
Wow.
And that was it for him. No, he didn't get any other representation after that.
One must be careful with the company card.
Yeah, don't buy socks, please. The Ruskies. Okay, next group. They were a band. Brian was judging a talent contest, and this is the group that won during that talent show. And of course, he approached them and said, hey,
you got what it takes.
You got what it takes, kids. And why don't you join the Beatles on their 1964 British tour? Thank you very much. They did. And yeah, nothing really got going for them either. Like, never had a huge hit or anything. Okay, moving on. The Paramounts. These bands just keep coming. Why are there so many? They had a hit with Poison Ivy. We talked about that song earlier. The Rolling Stones had covered it, I remember. But anyway, they split soon after they got signed, although they kind of disintegrated. The keyboard player went on to form Procol Harum, who had Whiter Shade of Pale, and so that's their thing. They're a footnote in Procol Harum's history. All right, and then we're done. Just kidding, we're not. We got a few more. Tony Rivers and the Castaways. What? Have you ever heard of them? No?
No.
Maybe. If you have, write in. I'd be interested. Tony Rivers and the Castaways. Again, I don't have a lot of information on some of these. They didn't have any hits. Then we have Cliff Bennett and the Rebel Rousers. They had a few singles through Parlophone, although they weren't signed to Parlophone. And they were produced by Joe Meek. Do you know Joe Meek at all, that name?
Only from the outboard gear.
Right.
Like the compressors and preamps.
Yeah, I mean, well, he's said to have like invented the compressor, or at least the modern idea of a compressor.
Interesting.
So yeah, he's a producer that he feels like a Phil Spector status, although I don't think he's a songwriter or anything, but he's like, he's got that kind of iconic sound that people love. Anyway, Cliff Bennett, produced by Joe Meek, and anyway, they were signed with Brian in September 1964. Here we are. And after that, one of their singles charted was One Way Love, with the B-side of Slow Down that the Beatles also performed. And they opened for the Beatles on their final 1966 European tour, which we'll talk about someday. Paddy, Klaus, and Gibson. That's another band that got signed to NEMS. And you might be thinking, what is that exactly? Klaus? That sounds familiar. I'm not sure. So anyway, this Paddy, Klaus, and Gibson is Paddy Chambers and Gibson Kemp. They were in other Mersey bands. The Big Three, King Size Taylor and the Dominoes. That's another huge name that people talk about from the early days. And Klaus, in this case, is Klaus Forman, the person who singularly discovered the Beatles, in my opinion. Discovered, whatever. People knew the Beatles before Klaus, but I'm just saying he started this big movement in Hamburg. Anyway, we'll talk about that soon. And Paddy Chambers mentions that he didn't think they received anything from NEMS in terms of management, which is kind of the story with all of these things, is that Brian had no bandwidth to do anything. I don't even think he had bandwidth to do the Beatles, let alone anything else. Now, he did have, an organization. He did have different people working for him. We know that like Alistair Taylor, one of his assistants and associates, managed some of these acts. I've read specific things like that, but regardless, there's no way that this organization can just do everything, especially without being a professional management outfit. Brian came from furniture stores, music stores. He didn't know anything about this. And we're going to get into Brian's story a little bit more also in this album, but just suffice it to say that it got out of control. And it's no surprise to me that, things were so chaotic with Brian in his final years. And then we have one more like documented one. I'm sure there's plenty of more because all these ones keep popping up. So as I say, tell me what I missed. But they briefly managed the Moody Blues, actually, who, obviously the Moody Blues in their own right is like a huge band, although I would say they really went crazy post, NEMS management or whatever. But of course, one of the members of that band was Denny Lane, who went on to become a member of Wings. Pretty much the only other member of Wings other than Paul and Linda in terms of permanent. Later, Brian bought some management companies, including one with Robert Stigwood, and NEMS inherited a bunch of bands. So before you go writing in, the Bee Gees and all this stuff, there's some asterisks with that. I don't really count those as official NEMS bands because that was towards the end of, Brian's life and this whole thing. And then after that, they really got separated into different entities due to figuring out who's going to run NEMS and that whole thing. But this includes Cream. This includes The Who, Bee Gees. So it was like a brief merge of companies where, you could say that they overlapped. And, when Brian dies, Robert Stigwood is removed and Clive takes over. Clive Epstein, maybe Brian's brother. He takes over NEMS. So Stigwood's out, and he takes the bands with him or whatever. So it's maybe not official, but I just wanted to mention that here. Tommy Quickly and the NEMS stable.
That was satisfying, and I think I can rest easy knowing that the stable is not a collection of horses, but it was actually okay.
Every time I've mentioned that now in the past, you've thought horses, have you?
It's a significant source of confusion in my life.
Yes, he did like riding horses, so it is an understandable confusion. But yes, no, I did. I'm talking about musical artists.